On June 11, 1889, 3 flatbreads were delivered to the royal palace of Capodimonte in Naples, not as a culinary honor, but as a counterinsurgency pacification tactic against a starving Neapolitan peasantry recovering from a cholera epidemic that killed 7,000 people. Look at the $160 billion industrial commodity sitting inside a corrugated cardboard box on a Friday night, insulated, sanitized, and engineered for absolute uniformity across continents. Now reconcile that frictionless delivery with a quarantine ration born in the lightless, damp alleys of a dying port city. How did a despised survival mechanic of a sealed-off population become the ultimate standardized global asset? And what exact biological and human toll paid for this transition? The transformation was not an accident of culture. It was a triumph of commodity warfare. We look at the shelf and see convenience, but the logistics of the modern supply chain are always written in displacement. If you look at the food sitting in your own pantry right now, almost every staple hides a ledger written in blood and trade routes. Tell me in the comments which everyday item you want me to dissect next and where in the world you are listening from. The archives never empty, and we are going to open them all. Go back 5 years before the palace delivery. The year is 1884. Naples is not a romantic postcard of the Mediterranean coastline. It is an urban pressure cooker holding 400,000 bodies trapped in a collapsing medieval grid. The working class lived in the bossy, windowless ground floor rooms that rarely saw sunlight, where families slept alongside their livestock. When the Asiatic cholera bacterium hit the city's contaminated aqueducts that summer, the mortality was absolute. The state did not send medical aid. The state imposed a sanitary siege. The military cordoned off the lower districts, trapping the poorest citizens in a labyrinth of stone that smelled permanently of quicklime, raw sewage, and rotting wood. People died by the thousands on the cobblestones, and the surviving population lived on whatever dense caloric mass could be pulled from the ashes of street braziers. When the epidemic finally burned itself out, leaving 7,000 corpses in mass graves, the government in Rome initiated a brutal military urban planning operation known as the Risanamento. The word translates to healing, but the strategy was targeted demolition. The state drove wide, straight boulevards directly through the slums. They did not do this to bring in fresh air. They did it to ensure cavalry and artillery could easily navigate the districts to suppress future riots. They gutted the architecture of the poor, leaving behind a terrified, starving underclass teetered on the edge of a violent separatist revolt. The physical landscape of the city was shattered, and the economic engines of the street were paralyzed. By 1889, the newly unified Kingdom of Italy was fracturing under the weight of its own internal borders. King Umberto I and Queen Margherita of Savoy traveled south to Naples to inspect the unstable perimeter of their empire. The monarchy knew they were walking into a powder keg. The southern peasantry despised the northern crown, viewing them as foreign occupiers who taxed their misery and demolished their homes. The threat of an uprising was a mathematical certainty unless the tension could be absorbed. The crown needed a gesture of appeasement. They needed to signal to the crushed working class that the empire recognized their survival without actually ceding any political power. They turned to the most marginalized, despised caloric fuel of the Neapolitan underclass, the flatbread baked on the open street. The royals did not request this bread out of curiosity. They consumed it as a calculated tactical surrender, a temporary peace treaty forged in cheap carbohydrates to prevent a civil war.
The man chosen to execute this political theater was a local baker named Raffaele Esposito, operating out of Pizzeria Brandy. He understood the geopolitical assignment perfectly. He took the crude peasant dough and weaponized it with the colors of the recently united Italian flag: the red of the tomato, the white of the cheese, and the green of the basil. He branded the survival ration with the insignia of the conquering state. The monarchy approved the prototype, stamped the Queen's name on it, and fed the narrative directly to the press. It was not a recipe. It was a drafted treaty of assimilation. The state co-opted the desperate food of the slums, sanitizing its history of disease, quarantine, and starvation into a neat, patriotic myth. They took a symbol of absolute urban poverty and turned it into an instrument of national cohesion. But the reality of what the peasants were actually consuming on the ground was far darker than the royal decree suggested. Esposito wrapped the bread in the flag, but before the royal marketing, what exactly did foreign travelers see when they looked at the street food of Naples? 45 years before the tricolor flag was draped over the dough, the outside world looked at the streets of Naples and recoiled. In 1844, Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, walked through the open-air markets and documented his absolute revulsion. He did not see culinary artisanship. He saw a biological hazard. He described a flatbread that resembled a piece of refuse pulled directly from a sewer, a dark, spongy mass covered in the disgusting food of dirt and flies. Alexandre Dumas, arriving in the same era, recorded the exact anatomy of this street trade. The French novelist observed a population subsisting on discs of fermented starch smeared with whatever cheap fat could be scraped from the slaughterhouse floor. They masked the rancid taste with crushed raw garlic, coarse salt, and the heads of tiny, decaying fish. There was no romance in the bite. The physical reality of the food was a collision of sharp metallic fat and the heavy humiliation of foreign scrutiny. The odor of unwashed bodies standing over the street braziers mingled with the sharp acidic vapor of spoiled milk and cheap oils, creating an atmosphere that tasted like poverty itself. This was not a curated experience. It was the absolute unforgiving math of human survival against starvation. The dough was essentially a dense, cheap flesh kneaded by exhausted hands in wooden troughs that were never washed. It relied entirely on the ambient bacteria of the humid port city for a rapid, volatile fermentation. Yeast was not a measured, controlled ingredient. It was an act of biological attrition, a wild organism attacking the flour under the oppressive Mediterranean heat. Men and barefoot boys baked these heavy discs over open fires, fueled by scrap wood, broken furniture, and the rotting, waterlogged debris pulled from the harbor docks. The ash from the incinerated refuse coated the crust, embedding the taste of the collapsing city directly into the calories. Hygiene was an irrelevant concept when the daily objective was simply to load enough crude caloric tonnage into the stomach of a laborer to ensure his heart kept beating for another 12 hours. The bread was a crude biological engine of energy, designed to keep a disposable underclass functioning at the absolute minimum cost. But a local economy built on scraping calories from the gutters eventually fractures. By the late 19th century, the newly unified Italian state realized it could no longer feed the demographic explosion occurring in its southern territories. The agricultural yield of the region was stagnant, choked by corrupt landholding monopolies and exhausted, overworked soil. The government in Rome looked at the sprawling, diseased slums of Naples and recognized a mathematical impossibility. They could not provide wheat, and they could not provide infrastructure.
So they changed the calculation. If the state could not sustain the biological demands of its own citizens, it would simply export the physical bodies. The Atlantic Ocean ceased to be a geographic barrier and instantly became a logistical release valve. The transition was brutal and immediate. The calculus of human survival shifted from the microscopic biology of wild yeast to the colossal mechanics of maritime tonnage, insurance policies, and steam navigation. In 1891, the British passenger steamship SS Utopia sat anchored in the Bay of Naples, taking on a specific type of cargo. The cargo was human. Hundreds of southern Italians, stripped of their land and starved by their own government's indifference, were loaded into the dark, suffocating steerage compartments of the iron vessel.
The maritime manifests from that era do not read like passenger lists. They read like ledgers of mass displacement, detailing the exact weight and volume of a desperate labor force. Families were packed into the lower decks, breathing air thick with smell of coal smoke, vomit, and wet wool. They carried the memory of their survival bread in their minds, but they were leaving the entire botanical ecosystem that created it behind on the docks. They were not immigrants chasing a dream. They were a quarantined workforce escaping a dead economy. As the massive steamships pushed through the freezing, violent swells of the Atlantic, the organic infrastructure of Naples was permanently severed. The soft, native wheat that had grown for centuries in the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius could not be packed into the holds of the ships. The specific, localized strains of yeast that lived in the humid alleyways, the crude olive oil presses, the specific thermal properties of the scrap wood fires, all of the physical living elements that dictated the biology of the bread were marooned on the Italian peninsula. The survival ration was about to be dropped into an entirely different theater of operations. It was moving from a medieval port city operating on the edge of famine into the hyper-industrialized, mechanically driven heart of the United States. What happens to an ancient mechanism of survival when the specific botanical environment that gave it life is systematically eradicated, only to be replaced by the ruthless, standardized efficiency of an industrial empire? The workforce arrived in the New World, but the seeds that sustained the biology of that bread did not survive the voyage. When the exiled population of Naples disembarked onto the freezing concrete of Lower Manhattan, they did not step into a land of opportunity. They were immediately absorbed into a grinding, mechanical ghetto. The year is 1905, and the physical reality of Spring Street is dictated by the pale, suffocating winter light that barely penetrates the narrow, vertical corridors between tenement buildings. The air carried the permanent, industrial cold of the North Atlantic wind, a sharp, unforgiving temperature that bit straight through the cheap, unlined cotton coats of the Southern labor force. These crowded streets operated as a massive engine of flesh and bone, driven entirely by the absolute exhaustion bleeding out of the nearby garment factories and shipping yards. The workers trapped in this rigid urban grid required immediate high-density fuel simply to sustain their kinetic output. When a man named Gennaro Lombardi opened a grocery storefront on Spring Street that same year, he was not launching a leisure dining establishment for the American public. He was operating a critical supply depot. He was moving crude carbohydrate mass to manual laborers who needed to consume enough calories during a 10-minute factory whistle break to ensure they did not collapse on the assembly line before the end of their shift. But the physical environment of New York dictated a violent shift in the energy matrix used to create this fuel. The old, slow infrastructure of the Mediterranean was dead. There were no open cobblestone braziers fed by the rotting, salt-soaked scrap wood of a dying harbor. The American industrial machine ran on a vastly superior, far more aggressive fuel source pulled directly from the earth: Pennsylvania anthracite coal. Lombardi and his laborers built massive subterranean brick chambers designed to burn this dense, heavy rock. The physics of the cooking process were instantly weaponized. A wood fire in the damp alleys of Naples might reach irregular, fluctuating temperatures, but the heavy iron doors of an anthracite coal oven locked in a brutal ambient heat of 500 degrees Celsius. The narrow streets surrounding the storefront were continuously dusted with the microscopic exhaust of this extraction operation. You could taste it in the back of your throat, a visceral sensory collision. The fine black dust of anthracite settling over the damp canvas of the dough, combined with the sharp metallic smell of a rapidly expanding economy built on heavy industry. This extreme thermal environment triggered the first massive biological casualty in the transatlantic supply chain. The soft, low-protein durum wheat that had been imported from the Italian peninsula was structurally incapable of surviving the new energy matrix. In a low-temperature, open-air wood fire, the native Italian flour behaved predictably, yielding a soft, perishable mass. But when factory laborers shoved that same delicate biological material into a 500-degree coal furnace, the cellular walls of the dough shattered on impact. The soft wheat charred instantly, blistering into bitter, useless ash before the center could even stabilize. The Mediterranean grain was an agricultural artifact of a slower agrarian world, and it was actively failing against the brutal machinery of the American Empire. The logistics chain required an immediate structural substitute to prevent total caloric failure. The brokers running the grocery depots looked westward, away from the ocean, and toward the sprawling mechanized plains of the Dakotas. The grain did not adapt. It was replaced. The soft wheat born from the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius was systematically eradicated from the formula, entirely substituted by the hard, high-protein spring wheat being harvested by the ton in the American Midwest. This new grain was a completely different botanical agent. It was processed through the massive steel roller mills of Minneapolis and engineered to yield an immense, dense network of gluten. This gluten acted as an industrial scaffolding, a biological armor robust enough to withstand the severe thermal shock of burning anthracite. When mixed with water, the Dakota wheat formed an unyielding elastic matrix that refused to tear, blister, or collapse under the violent heat of the coal oven. The fundamental anatomy of the food was permanently altered. It was no longer an expression of an ancient local ecosystem. The bread was now a direct structural byproduct of American coal mining and Midwestern agricultural monoculture. The chemistry was locked in, sealing the formula for mass production. It could be stretched wider, baked faster, and handled by anyone, effectively phasing out the need for specialized human artisanship. The raw materials were now doing the heavy lifting, standardizing a chaotic survival ration into a predictable industrial asset that could be replicated endlessly across the expanding urban grid. We are tracking the ghost ships and the supply lines that built the modern world. If you want to keep seeing what the ledgers hide, subscribe to the channel. The archives never empty. By marrying the heavy extraction of the Pennsylvania coal mines with the endless agricultural tonnage of the Dakota plains, the blueprint for total global expansion was finalized. The laborers operating in the shadows of Spring Street had unknowingly perfected a mechanical process that stripped the food of its organic fragility. The sheer volume of synthetic calories that could now be pushed out of a single brick furnace was staggering, shifting the entire operation from a localized neighborhood necessity to a highly profitable, scalable logistical model. The coal oven forged the structure, but to dominate the planet, the bread would need to defeat the greatest enemy of logistics, the biological clock of decomposition. The structural chassis forged by Pennsylvania coal allowed the mass to hold its shape, but to achieve total continental dominance, the commodity had to conquer the most unforgiving variable in the supply chain: distance. Following the end of the Second World War, the demographic map of the United States fractured and spread outward. The dense, vertical slums of the industrial cities were replaced by the sprawling, decentralized grid of the American suburb. This new residential perimeter required a completely different logistical apparatus. If a carbohydrate ration was going to be profitable on a national scale, it could no longer rely on the immediate proximity of a neighborhood oven. It had to survive transit. It had to sit in distribution depots. It had to endure the slow, grinding friction of highway freight. The primary enemy of this expansion was not a rival industry. The enemy was the biological reality of the ingredients themselves. The fresh cheese originally used on the streets of Naples was a living, breathing emulsion of water, animal fat, and lactic acid. It was an agricultural byproduct with a microscopic lifespan, designed to be consumed within hours of its creation. In a localized, pedestrian economy, this freshness was a necessity. In a mechanized, continental supply chain, the ambient moisture of fresh cheese was a severe tactical weakness. When subjected to heat, the high water content of the traditional dairy bled outward. It hemorrhaged liquid directly into the Dakota wheat scaffolding, turning the entire unit into a collapsing, unstable mass of soaked starch. It was structurally impossible to box, stack, or ship across state lines. The water inside the cheese was actively resisting the industrial mandate for uniformity. It fostered bacteria. It accelerated decomposition. Distance equals time, and time is the silent executioner of organic matter. To secure the logistics network, the water had to be eradicated. The solution was not found in a kitchen, but in the sterile, calculating laboratories of the American dairy industry. In 1950, food engineers in Wisconsin filed the critical patents that would permanently alter the anatomy of the product. They approached the milk not as an agricultural harvest to be nurtured, but as a fluid dynamic problem that required an immediate chemical intervention. Inside the sprawling stainless steel processing plants, mechanical presses replaced human hands. By heavily manipulating the curdling process, applying massive industrial pressure, and violently extracting the latent moisture, they achieved a total structural re-engineering of the protein. The archival documents from these mid-century dairy consortiums do not read like culinary records. They are drafted as insurance policies against the laws of nature. This new low-moisture mozzarella was stripped of its biological vulnerability. What remained after the extraction was a dense, dehydrated brick of concentrated fat and protein. It did not bleed when exposed to high thermal stress. It did not sour in the back of a delivery truck. It behaved less like an organic foodstuff and more like a vulcanized rubber engineered for the dairy sector, possessing an unnatural, highly predictable melting point and absolute structural integrity. The wild, sour odor of fresh living milk was replaced by the sterile, vacant scent of a stabilized industrial polymer.
The tactical weakness was eliminated. The physical decay of the ingredient had been successfully halted. But even with the moisture extracted from the cheese and the Dakota wheat functioning as an unyielding armor, the commodity still harbored one final rogue biological agent. The yeast trapped inside the dough was still breathing. It was still digesting sugars, still emitting carbon dioxide, still aging. The fermentation process was a ticking clock, and as long as the organism remained alive, the product could not be fully stockpiled as a permanent, non-perishable asset. The final, devastating victory over the biology of the food was executed in 1962 by a businesswoman in Minnesota named Rose Totino. The mechanism of defeat was cryogenic. Totino recognized that the only way to mass-produce the commodity for the deep-freeze aisles of the new suburban supermarkets was to subject the dough to an extreme thermodynamic shock. She pioneered the application of industrial flash freezing to the assembled disc. This was a brutal, instantaneous assault on the microscopic ecosystem. Inside the freezing tunnels of her production plants, massive conveyor belts carried thousands of units into chambers blasting air at -30 degrees Fahrenheit. By plunging the fully constructed product into this artificial winter, the kinetic energy of the water molecules was halted instantly. The rapid freezing paralyzed the living yeast cells, shattering their ability to reproduce, and locking the entire organism in a state of indefinite suspended animation. The biological clock was not just slowed down, it was violently disconnected. The fermentation was halted entirely. The dough was no longer baked to be consumed, it was manufactured to be hoarded. The living organism born in the damp alleys of Naples was now a cryogenic asset in a cardboard sleeve. The air trapped in the packaging smelled faintly of freezer burn and bleached cardboard, the unmistakable scent of a biological process that had been forcefully terminated. This was the ultimate victory of the Cold War against the ingredients. A survival ration that once rotted in the Mediterranean heat within 24 hours could now sit buried in the mechanical frost of a suburban freezer in Ohio for 8 months, emerging completely identical to a unit stockpiled in California. The standardization was absolute. The organic friction of the natural world had been successfully engineered out of the ledger. The logistics chain was now flawless, operating with a ruthless, frictionless efficiency.
The industrial machinery could endlessly stamp out these frozen dehydrated discs without ever worrying about spoilage or cellular decay. But this chemical triumph required a staggering, uninterrupted flow of raw materials to feed the cryogenic vats. The factories had mastered the manipulation of the matter, but they still had to extract it from the earth. The sheer volume of hard wheat and standardized dairy required to supply a global network of freezer aisles initiated a new, far more destructive campaign. The assembly lines could now send billions of units across oceans, but the final calculation was not levied in the factories, it was levied on the soil. To feed the massive continuous extrusion machines of the American Midwest, and eventually the globe, the agricultural empire required a botanical purge. The original seeds that birthed the Neapolitan flatbread were not merely left behind, they were systematically driven into commercial extinction. For centuries, the peasant farmers of the Italian peninsula had cultivated complex, localized varieties of durum wheat. Strains bearing names like Carosella and Saragola were living records of the Mediterranean climate. They were deeply rooted, biologically diverse organisms uniquely adapted to erratic rainfall, extreme heat, and exhausted soil.
Their tall, golden stalks swayed and bent with the coastal winds, harvested by hand in a brutal theater of manual labor. But in the eyes of a global supply chain demanding absolute structural uniformity, biological diversity is a severe logistical threat. Carosella and Saragola grew at inconsistent, unpredictable rates. Their tall, fragile stalks were prone to collapsing under heavy rains, an organic vulnerability that actively jammed the blades of mechanical combine harvesters. They possessed a stubborn, wild biology that could not survive the ruthless mathematics of 20th century industrial agriculture. So, the empire simply erased them from the ledger. The seeds were stripped from the fields, their genetic lineage buried beneath a corporate mandate for rapid, synchronized yields. The tactile reality of milling grain by hand, feeling the coarse, irregular powder between calloused fingers, was replaced by the deafening hum of automated steel rollers grinding millions of tons of uniform dust. The vacuum left by the eradication of native Italian grains was rapidly filled by a heavily engineered, militarized replacement. The agricultural conglomerates deployed dwarf wheat. This was a stunted, thick-stalked botanical agent designed specifically to carry an unnaturally massive grain head without snapping under its own weight. It was an anatomical freak of modern engineering. But this synthetic architecture came with a staggering biological cost. The dwarf wheat was completely incapable of surviving on its own in the natural ecosystem. It lacked the deep, probing root systems of the ancient Carosella, making it entirely helpless against drought or competing organisms. To keep this fragile monoculture alive across millions of acres, the earth itself had to be forcefully altered. The soil was effectively placed on chemical life support. It was injected with millions of tons of synthetic ammonium nitrate. This was a chemical compound originally manufactured by the megaton to create high explosives and artillery shells during the Second World War. When the war ended, the munitions factories did not dismantle their machinery. They simply redirected their nitrogen payloads from the battlefield into the dirt. The complex, living ecosystem of the agrarian terrace was obliterated. In its place rose a silent, synthetic desert of identical green stalks stretching across the Dakotas and beyond, smelling faintly of sulfur and metallic runoff. The crop was now entirely dependent on fossil fuels and chemical armor to survive until the harvest. Growth requires fuel. Uniformity requires eradication. The biological wipeout was total, but the financial victory was unprecedented. The transition of this asset is now complete. Look at the balance sheet of the modern world. We have taken a crude, fermented disk of survival starch, a desperate caloric mechanism baked over scrap wood in a quarantine zone surrounded by 7,000 cholera corpses, and engineered it into a $160 billion global commodity.
The damp, metallic scent of raw garlic and decaying harbor debris has been sterilized into the hollow, predictable odor of warm corrugated cardboard and insulated delivery bags. It is no longer a foodstuff, it is an industrial unit of trade. It is a frictionless carbohydrate traded on international futures markets, heavily subsidized by state agricultural policies, wrapped in bleached paper, and distributed with military precision by satellite-tracked fleets to every suburban grid on the planet. The human beings who first kneaded that heavy flesh of flour in the lightless alleys of Naples are dead. The steamships that carried them across the Atlantic in freezing steerage compartments have been scrapped for iron. The native seeds that grew in the volcanic shadow of Mount Vesuvius have been erased from the commercial registry, replaced by patented genetic clones soaking in wartime fertilizer.
You open the cardboard box on a Friday evening, expecting a casual convenience, but the object sitting inside is a forensic document detailing a century of extraction. Every perfectly uniform slice is a record of shattered botanical diversity, chemical saturation, and the forced displacement of a starving workforce. What sat on a wooden plank in 19th century Naples was an anchor of human survival. What sits on your kitchen table tonight is a masterclass in industrial standardization. We traded the soil for the supply chain. Until the next dispatch, keep your eyes on the cargo.